The small city of Greenwood was buzzing with election fever. Posters of smiling candidates with promises of a better tomorrow and change for all covered almost every wall, lamppost, and bus stop. Local parks turned into rally grounds, while restaurants and cafes became spots for heated political debates. Citizens passionately argued over who would be the best leader, who could bring real change, and who would care about people like them. In the middle of this chaos was a man everyone knew but barely noticed, the Nameless One. This nickname was given to a quiet, humble-looking man who roamed the streets in simple clothes, often carrying a worn-out backpack with a few essentials. No one knew where he came from or how he had ended up on the streets, but his calm demeanor and kindness made him a familiar face in Greenwood. Unlike most people, the Nameless One seemed uninterested in politics. He didn't care about the promises on posters or the rallies filling the streets. Instead, he spent his days helping the street vendors set up their stalls or offering a comforting word to other homeless people he met along the way. To him, the city was a place of people, not politicians. He believed that true change didn't come from slogans, but from small, everyday acts of kindness. Each morning, the Nameless One visited a small corner of Greenwood where an old woman named Mary sat on a bench. Mary was blind, and her world was a place of sounds, smells, and memories. She couldn't see the election posters or the colors of the city, but she could feel the energy and excitement around her. "Good morning, Mary," the Nameless One would greet her in his gentle voice. "Ah, my dear friend," Mary would reply with a smile, her eyes closed but her face full of warmth. "Tell me, what's the city like today? What are people wearing? Is the sky as blue as I remember?" The Nameless One would sit beside her, carefully choosing his words as if he were painting a picture in her mind. He described the bright red and blue posters, the people dressed in their finest clothes to attend rallies, and the colorful leaves falling from the trees. He told her about the children laughing as they played near the election booths, and the little birds that hopped on the pavement, oblivious to the human excitement around them. "Everything is so alive, Mary," he would say softly. "Even with all the noise and the big promises, there's still a beauty in the little things. And one day, if you could see it again, I know you'd find it even more beautiful." Mary would smile, reaching out to squeeze his hand in gratitude. Their friendship was a source of warmth and light in her life. The Nameless One's voice was her connection to a world she could no longer see, and through his words, she found a peace that made her feel a part of the city despite her blindness. As they sat together, people passed by without giving them a second glance. Most were too busy, rushing to the next rally or debate. The Nameless One didn't mind. He liked blending into the background. But to Mary, he was a hero, a gentle, unseen soul who brought her world to life each day, despite having little himself. While the city focused on finding the next leader, the Nameless One continued his quiet mission. He was invisible to most, but to Mary, he was the city's brightest light. One afternoon, as the Nameless One sat beside Mary, watching the usual bustle of the city, a piece of news caught his attention. A flyer fluttered by in the breeze, and he caught it before it could drift away. The bold headline read, "A New Hope for Greenwood." He glanced over the flyer, intrigued. The name at the top was unfamiliar, Ethan Miller. Beneath it, a brief description promised that Miller was a man of the people, a candidate who had risen from humble beginnings. Unlike the others, he wasn't a millionaire or a career politician. No, Miller claimed to understand the struggles of the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. His campaign focused on solving the city's biggest problems: poverty, healthcare, and inequality. The Nameless One's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the answer he had been waiting for? For the past several weeks, he had noticed the increasing number of posters around the city, shiny and professional, promising change with slick words and glamorous faces. But Miller's message felt different. It felt real. There was something about the way he spoke about helping the underserved that stirred something in the Nameless One. He wasn't a politician speaking to the rich and powerful. He was a man who seemed to speak to people like Mary, like him. And Mary, his dear friend, was growing weaker. Over time, she had told him how she missed the simple things, the colors of a sunset, the faces of children playing in the park, the bright lights that lit up the streets at night. But lately, Mary had begun to express a new fear. She was afraid of never seeing again. The Nameless One learned that Mary's blindness could be treated through a surgical procedure. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something real, a procedure that could give her sight again, a chance for her to see the world she had only ever dreamed of. The only problem was the cost. The surgery was expensive, far too expensive for someone like Mary, someone who barely had enough to eat each day. As the days went by, the Nameless One's thoughts kept returning to Miller's campaign. He began to believe that this was his chance. This could be the moment where everything changed. If Miller truly cared about the city's problems, surely he would help. The Nameless One decided that he would try, at the very least. He would find a way to speak with Miller, to explain Mary's story and ask for help. He had nothing but a few crumpled bills in his pocket, earned from small jobs helping vendors with their carts or offering his assistance to those in need. But it was enough to cover a ticket to one of Miller's campaign rallies. Maybe, just maybe, the candidate would hear him out. The next day, as the sun began to set, the Nameless One stood in line at the rally, his heart pounding in his chest. The streets were crowded with people, all buzzing with excitement. The atmosphere was electric. People shouted Miller's name, waving banners with his face printed on them. Some wore shirts emblazoned with his slogan, "Together we rise." He found a spot near the front, where Miller would soon speak. The crowd around him was filled with eager faces, all hoping that this man, this voice of change, would be their savior. As the speeches began, the Nameless One listened intently, feeling both inspired and frustrated. Miller talked about sweeping reforms, universal health care, and an end to inequality. The words were uplifting, but they felt distant, as though they were meant for people who had the means to take advantage of them, not for people like him or Mary. Finally, after the rally, the Nameless One saw his chance. The crowd surged around Miller as he made his way through a barricade, shaking hands with supporters and posing for photos. The Nameless One pushed through the crowd, determined to get close enough to speak. But as he neared, he was blocked by a group of Miller's staffers. They were young, eager, and dressed in sharp suits, and they quickly formed a wall around the candidate. The Nameless One tried to speak, to explain that he had a story that could change everything, but they didn't even look at him. Instead, they directed him away, telling him that the candidate was too busy for such personal matters. The Nameless One stood there for a moment, his hope crumbling like dry leaves in his hands. He had gotten so close, he had tried, but the wall of people, of politics, was too high to climb. As the crowd began to thin out, he found himself alone in the shadows of the rally. The city lights flickered above him, casting long shadows across the streets. It was as if the city itself was whispering that change was never truly within reach for people like him. Yet, as he thought of Mary, sitting alone on her bench, waiting for him to come back, a flicker of hope remained. He couldn't give up, not yet. If the city had its champions, then so did he. The days passed, but the Nameless One couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His encounter with Ethan Miller had left him disheartened, but not defeated. After all, what other choice did he have? If the politician wouldn't listen, maybe the people would. Determined not to give up, he turned to the one tool he had: social media. He wasn't a man of technology, but over the last few years he had seen the power of the internet, how it could amplify voices, bring people together, and even force change. He could tell Mary's story in a way that might touch the hearts of others. He borrowed a worn-out smartphone from a kind passerby who had seen him trying to find a place to charge his own device. The screen was cracked, and it had trouble loading pages, but it was enough to get started. With shaky hands, he created a simple post. "I have a friend. Her name is Mary. She is blind, and she has lived in this city all her life, but she can't see the beauty that's around her. She could be treated, given the chance to see again, but the cost of the surgery is too much. I have no money to help her. I only have this city. Can someone out there help us?" He posted the message, along with a photo of Mary sitting on the bench with her cane resting beside her, her hands folded in her lap, her face peaceful despite the darkness that clouded her eyes. He didn't know if anyone would notice, but within hours people began to share it. And then more people. Suddenly, the story of a blind woman and a nameless man trying to bring light into her life began to spread like wildfire. Soon, the post was everywhere. It was featured on local news outlets, picked up by activists, and shared by people across the city. His message became a talking point in cafes, online forums, and at rallies. It seemed that Mary's story resonated deeply with people. In a time when politics was dominated by promises of progress, this quiet tale of kindness and hope struck a chord. But as the days went by, the nameless one began to notice something troubling. While his post gained momentum, it also became something else, something he hadn't anticipated. His message, his story, was being used as a tool, a narrative, a perfect piece of emotional bait for a campaign that needed a human interest angle. One evening he sat in front of his phone, watching the latest news segment about Ethan Miller's campaign. The anchor spoke of how Miller's team had heard the voices of the people and was now dedicated to addressing the needs of the underprivileged. The screen flashed to an image of Mary, her face now everywhere, on billboards, on websites, on television. It was the same photo the nameless one had posted, but it had been altered, cropped, and framed with bold text. "A city that cares for its own. Will you help us make a change?" The nameless one's heart sank. The words on the screen didn't sound like anything he had hoped for. There was no mention of him, no mention of Mary's need for help, no mention of real action. It was just another political campaign playing on the emotions of people who wanted to feel good about themselves. When he showed Mary the new image, she didn't understand what had happened. "It looks like people care," she said, smiling faintly. "Maybe the city will help us." But the nameless one knew the truth. The story wasn't about Mary anymore. It was about Miller's campaign. His personal plea, his quiet act of love for Mary had been opted by a system that promised to help, but ultimately served only its own interests. The next day, he went to another rally. This time, he was determined to confront Miller. He had to ask him directly why nothing had changed, why his story had been twisted into a mere political tool. The rally was packed, just like the others. People cheered as Miller took the stage, flanked by supporters and his campaign team. The nameless one fought through the crowd, pushing his way to the front. When he finally made it to the barricade, he felt a rush of anger and frustration. "Mr. Miller," he called, his voice cutting through the noise. "I need to speak to you. You promised change. You promised help. I need you to help Mary." Miller's face froze for a moment, recognizing him from the viral photo. A staff member quickly stepped forward, trying to block the nameless one's path. "Sorry, sir," the staffer said coldly. "You're not allowed to interrupt the candidate. Please step back." But the nameless one wouldn't be stopped. He pushed forward, his voice shaking. "You used her story. You used us to win votes. But where is the help? Where is the action?" Miller finally turned to him, offering a forced smile. "We're doing what we can, but this is a long-term process, friend. Change takes time. I appreciate your passion, really, but you need to understand that." "Don't give me that," the nameless one interrupted. "You're playing with people's lives. Mary can't wait for your PR. Mary can't wait for your promises. She needs help now, not in some far-off future." Security guards stepped in, ushering him away, warning him not to cause trouble. The nameless one was forced out of the rally, his heart heavy with the weight of his disillusionment. As he walked through the dark streets, the city seemed colder than ever. The bright lights that had once symbolized hope now seemed like distant stars, far away, unreachable. The nameless one realized something he had feared all along. The system, the politicians, the campaigns, they weren't going to help people like him. They weren't going to help Mary. The only person who could make a difference was him. He could no longer wait for a miracle. The cost of illusions had become clear. It was time for him to act, even if it meant doing it alone. The Nameless One wandered through the city streets, his mind a tangle of thoughts. The rally had left him feeling drained, disillusioned, and even a little angry. He had given everything, his time, his heart, his effort, to bring attention to Mary's plight, and all he had received in return was empty promises and political games. The weight of the world felt heavier than ever. The cold autumn wind cut through his worn jacket as he sat down on a curb near the market, his head in his hands. He had no more leads, no more ideas. He had tried everything except giving up. But as he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a familiar voice broke through the fog of frustration. Well, well, if it isn't the city's kindest soul. The Nameless One looked up, surprised to see Sal, a street vendor he had often helped over the years. Sal was a grizzled man, with a permanent smile that never seemed to fade, no matter the hardships of life. He owned a small fruit stall at the edge of the market, where he sold apples, oranges, and other fresh produce. Every morning he'd set up his cart, and the Nameless One would stop by to help him lift crates or chase off the stray dogs that wandered too close. Sal had always been kind to him, offering him a free apple or a cup of warm coffee on chilly mornings. The two had struck up a quiet friendship over the months, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to survive in a world that often overlooked them. "You look like you've seen better days, my friend," Sal said, sitting down beside him. "What's going on?" The Nameless One sighed, his eyes distant. He didn't want to burden Sal with his troubles, but something about the old vendor's kind eyes made him feel as though he could share his pain. "It's Mary," he said quietly, his voice almost breaking. "I've tried everything. I've reached out to everyone, politicians, people with money. But no one is willing to help. I thought I could make a difference. I thought I could change things for her. But I can't do it alone." Sal's face softened, and he placed a hand on the Nameless One's shoulder. "You've done more than most people would. You've been there for her when nobody else cared. That means something. I know it's hard, but sometimes the world needs a little push in the right direction." The Nameless One didn't know what to say. He appreciated Sal's words, but they didn't change the reality of the situation. Mary's surgery still required a small fortune, money that he simply didn't have. But then Sal did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. He handed it to the Nameless One, his eyes steady and serious. "I've seen how much you care for that woman," Sal said, "and I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out. But I've got something here that might help. It's not much, but it's a start." The Nameless One opened the envelope to find a wad of cash, enough to make a dent in the cost of Mary's surgery. He stared at the money in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. I can't accept this," he said, shaking his head. "You've done so much already." Sal shrugged, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I've been on the receiving end of kindness before, my friend, and I've seen you help others, even when you had nothing. It's my turn now. This isn't charity. It's a thank you for all the times you've made my day a little easier. And hey, you're helping someone who needs it. That's what matters." The Nameless One blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the gesture. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. He took the money, knowing it was just a small part of the puzzle, but a crucial one. And then, something even more unexpected happened. Sal wasn't the only one to offer help. Over the following days, the Nameless One found that the kindness he had shown to others over the years was coming back to him in unexpected ways. Other familiar faces appeared, people he had helped at some point or another. Whether it was an elderly woman needing assistance with her shopping bags, a young man struggling to get his cart fixed, or a homeless veteran who had once shared a meal with him. One by one, they offered their help. Small donations, a few dollars here and there, a warm meal or a friendly word of encouragement. It wasn't much, but it added up. By the time the Nameless One had gathered all the money he needed, he was amazed at how the community had come together, despite all the struggles and hardships. It wasn't the big political promises or the flashy campaign slogans that had saved him. It was the people, the ones who saw him for what he was, who recognized the goodness in him and in Mary, and who wanted to help in whatever way they could. The morning of Mary's surgery arrived, and the nameless one could hardly contain his anxiety. He stood outside the hospital, pacing back and forth. His hands trembled, and his heart beat so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear the sounds of the city around him. He had done it. He had found a way to give Mary the chance she deserved. But the reality of what this moment meant hit him hard. If the surgery worked, if Mary could see again, everything would change. Her world would open up in ways she had never dreamed possible, and yet that was a heavy responsibility to bear. As he waited, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't control the outcome, he knew that. But he had done everything he could for her. He had fought for her, in ways both big and small, and now it was out of his hands. The doors of the hospital opened, and a nurse stepped out, smiling at him. The surgery went well. She's resting now, but you can see her soon. A flood of relief washed over him, and he felt his legs almost give way beneath him. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had been missing from his life: peace. As he walked into the room where Mary was resting, he found her sitting up in bed, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, but there was a new lightness in the air. The nameless one sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Mary," he said softly, "when you wake up, the world will look a little different." She smiled, her eyes still closed, as if she already knew. "I trust you, my friend," she replied. "I know it will be beautiful." And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, the nameless one believed it too. The day Mary opened her eyes to the world again was nothing short of miraculous. The soft light of the morning filtered in through the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the sterile room. As the nameless one sat beside her, his heart pounded in his chest. She had just woken up, still groggy from the anesthesia, her face pale but peaceful. For a moment she blinked several times, as though unsure of what was happening. "Mary," the nameless one whispered, leaning forward. "How do you feel?" Mary slowly turned her head, her eyes fluttering open. For the first time in years, her eyes met the world with something more than just an empty stare. The colors, the shapes, the light, all of it greeted her as though it had been waiting for her all along. She gasped softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. I can see," she whispered in awe. "I can see." The nameless one held his breath, his eyes fixed on her as she took in the world around her. The blurry shapes and colors gradually sharpened, the outlines of the room becoming clearer. Her gaze turned toward the window, and she gasped again. "The sky," she whispered, her voice trembling with wonder. "It's so blue. I never knew it could be so beautiful." Tears welled up in the nameless one's eyes as he watched Mary's joy. This was what he had fought for. This was why he had endured so much, why he had put his faith in a community of strangers who had come together to help her. This moment, her seeing the world for the first time, was worth everything. Mary turned to him, her face glowing with gratitude. "You made this possible," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. I never thought I would see again. And yet, here I am. You gave me back the light, my friend." The nameless one smiled gently, his heart full. "You gave me something too, Mary. You gave me a purpose." She took his hand in hers, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "The world you described to me. I can see it now. The way you told me about the flowers, the sunset, the faces of the people. Everything is more beautiful than I ever imagined." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. And then, as if remembering, Mary added, "But what about you, my friend? What about your story?" The nameless one looked down, his smile fading slightly. "I'm just a man. A simple man who happened to care, who happened to cross your path. There's nothing extraordinary about me." Mary's expression softened. But that's exactly what makes you extraordinary. You didn't do this for any reward or recognition. You did it because you believed in kindness. You believed in helping someone who needed you. Her words were like a balm to his soul, but they also reminded him of the reality he had been living in. The surgery had been a success, and Mary could see again, but the city outside hadn't changed. The world was still the same, and so was he. Just a nameless man, still wandering the streets, still unseen. The day after Mary's surgery, the city woke up to the announcement that the election results were in. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as the city's residents held their breath, hoping for change. But when the final count came through, it wasn't the hopeful candidate who had won. It was the incumbent, the one who had promised nothing but empty words and half-hearted solutions. The nameless one heard the news while sitting at his usual spot on the street corner, watching the world move by. The buzz of excitement and disappointment from the election was palpable, but he didn't join in. Instead, he watched as people went about their daily routines, consumed by the results, consumed by the politics that never seemed to change anything. He didn't need to follow the campaign. He knew that the system, the powers that be, would always disappoint. He had learned that long ago. The city would remain the same, divided, imperfect, full of empty promises. But the nameless one knew something that the politicians did not. Real change didn't come from the top down. It came from the bottom up, from the hands of ordinary people who cared enough to make a difference. As the election buzz settled into the background noise of the city's everyday hum, the nameless one felt a strange sense of peace. The political system had failed, but Mary's sight had been restored, and that, in his eyes, was enough. Days passed, and the nameless one returned to his routine, helping vendors, offering a kind word to strangers, and caring for Mary as she navigated her new world. Though she could see now, she was still learning how to adjust to the overwhelming reality of sight. It was a slow process, one filled with wonder and frustration. But the nameless one was there every step of the way, guiding her gently through the chaos of the world. One afternoon, as they sat together on a bench in the park, Mary turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder, my friend," she asked, "if your kindness has made a difference to anyone else? In this city, in this world?" The nameless one chuckled softly. "I don't need to wonder. I see it in the people who stop to thank me, in the faces of those I've helped. You can't measure kindness with numbers or votes. It's something that lives in small acts, in quiet moments." Mary nodded, her gaze distant. "It's strange, isn't it? How the world doesn't always reflect the kindness we try to spread. But maybe that's the way it's meant to be. Maybe it's the small moments that count." He smiled, knowing she was right. He had never expected the world to change because of one man's actions. But he had seen something far more important, the light that kindness brought to the people around him, the warmth it gave to those who needed it most. And that, he realized, was the true light of the city. As the days turned into weeks, the nameless one continued his quiet life in the city. Mary was adjusting to her newfound sight, and he was happy to simply be by her side. He knew the world outside hadn't changed, but the little corner of the world they had created together was enough. It was more than enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets began to glow with the soft golden light of dusk, the nameless one found himself standing on the same street corner where it had all begun. He looked around, seeing the same familiar faces, the vendors, the children playing, the commuters rushing by. But this time something was different. The city, despite its flaws, despite its failings, seemed a little brighter. He didn't need a title or a grand political victory to know that he had made a difference. In the hearts of those who had helped him, in the life he had shared with Mary, and in the small, everyday acts of kindness, he had found something far more meaningful than any election could offer, true change, and that was enough.